Now we'll move on to the next session. The session that is now to be after this is by Shri Deepa Kiranji and Christian Ji. Christian Ji is going to talk about the goddess Parā. The goddess Parā is the topic of Christian the Vietri Ji.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. Today I'll present about the goddess Parā, Parā Devi. The goddess Parā is the tutelary deity of the non-dualistic Shaiva tradition, which is referred to as the Trika. Trika Shaivism flourished in Kashmir and in India in the 9th and the 13th century, and a significant contribution to its development were the works of the great philosopher and exegete Rajanaka Abhinavagupta. Though the tradition has been through a long process of attrition since the 13th century and it was almost lost, it was revealed again by one of the last Kashmiri teachers of the Trika, Swami Lakshmanju, who transmitted the tradition to a few Westerners as well as Indians in the decades before his death in 1991. The tradition is now in a process of revival, not only in Kashmir and in India, but worldwide. It's a phenomenon which has been recently explored in depth by Douglas Ostow in his book, An Indian Tantric Tradition and Its Global Revival. My conviction, and that of many others, is that this tradition is not only of historical and philosophical interest, but contains saving knowledge that is really vital to humanity today. As a contribution to the contemporary evolution of the Trika, in 2016, I was inspired to create a sculpture of the goddess Parā. This presentation will briefly explore the significance of the goddess Parā within the context of the Trika and the creation of this artwork. Trika Shaivism is a study of consciousness, both from a theoretical and an experiential perspective. It is practical in its outlooks and its methods, which are aimed at self-realization. The philosophy of this tradition is centered around an understanding of consciousness as the ground of being, unbounded and infinite. The teachings and the practices of Trika Shaivism recognize that by aligning our individuality with the autonomous and free nature of consciousness, we experience more creativity, higher functioning, and an ever-deepening connection to the truth, sacredness, and beauty of embodied existence. While this tradition holds that consciousness is one, it also explains how its characteristics and its functions are many, and an entire pantheon of deities exists that embody these various aspects. These deity forms are described in writing, in texts, in the tradition, but most of them have never been presented in sculptural form, making it all the more pertinent to bring them to light for those seeking to authentically engage with the tradition in the present era. The iconographic elements of the deity forms are both indicators and activators, indicating via visual codes the aspect of consciousness being expressed by the deity and activating that same experience within the individual. Though these deity forms may at first resemble the iconography of certain religious systems, an engagement with Trika Shaivism is not a matter of practicing religion in the conventional sense, but is rather akin to a universal philosophical theory with profound and pragmatic applications. In the words of Swami Lakshmanju, Trika philosophy is meant for any human being, without restriction of caste, creed, or color. Its purpose is to enable you to rise from individuality to universality. Abhinavagupta, in his magnum opus, the Tantra Loka, speaks about the role of ritual and deity forms for a practitioner. Though the primary focus of the Trika, according to Abhinavagupta, is inner meditative practice, he does not suggest abandoning deity forms altogether, but rather he explains how one must aspire to see these forms as nothing less than one's own essential nature, collapsing any conception of difference between oneself and the deity. Alexis Sanderson, in his 1990 essay, Visualization of the Deities of the Trika, translates Abhinavagupta as follows. In this mirror-like consciousness, he should contemplate the images of the deities as reflections of himself, as the reflected. Now I'll show an image of the artwork and continue on. Is that visible? I trust it is.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So in creating this sculpture of the goddess Parā, I have attempted to honor the point of view of Abhinavagupta. Though Parā is a deity that would have been traditionally used for an internal visualization practice, the fact of her external materialization as a sculpture is not intended to elicit a separation between the observer and the work of art, but rather a unification of the viewer with what is being viewed. There are several visualization descriptions of the goddess Parā within the Trika textual corpus. The one followed as the basis for this representation is from the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata, translated by Mark Dishkowski as follows. One should visualize Parā with her own form, sitting on a lotus in the air, with the book of all knowledge in her left hand, O beautiful one, and holding a beautiful heavenly rosary of crystal in her right hand. One is to visualize a garland on her neck, a garland of heavenly beauty made up with beads which are round like the buds of the kadamba tree, and which shine forth like fire. This garland reaches down to her feet and is spotless as crystal all over. So this description is rendered anthropomorphically in my sculpture using the aesthetic and iconographic vocabulary of traditional Indo-Tibetan sacred art. And each element of the form expresses an aspect of the goddess Parā as she is described in the texts of the Trika tradition. Furthermore, the material of the sculpture, the shape of the sculpture, and the process by which it is sculpted have also been considered as ways of indicating and activating qualities associated with this goddess. In the Trika tradition, the goddess Parā is understood as the goddess of creation, the primordial will of consciousness in its unmanifest state to become manifest. In terms of the process of manifestation, she is the very first movement of the immanent that emerges in union with the transcendent. This subtle state she embodies is expressed in the description from the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata, where she is described as having a white body of crystal. Sculpting her in crystal was therefore a fitting medium for this goddess, who in her expressive capacity is the activating force that disperses the one light of consciousness into the variegated array of forms in the manifest world, just as a crystal disperses white light into the full spectrum of colors. The form of the goddess is embedded within the solid crystal sphere by a method of three-dimensional laser etching. This is done by sending millions of tiny beams of light into the interior of the crystal. At the focal point of each beam of light, a tiny occlusion is etched into the crystal, making up the appearance of the entire form, which then shines visibly when light from the outside passes through. This process is used because it approximates the manner in which she is described in the Trika texts, luminous white like sunshine on snow. The fine quality of the etching is a way of capturing the subtlety of her effulgent nature, demonstrating in material form that she is at the very edge of what can be seen, described, and depicted. This technique enables a vision of the goddess appearing to float weightless within the crystal, expressing immanence in union with transcendence, emerging subtly from infinite spaciousness as joyous creative impulse. It offers an experience of the goddess Parā as the highest principle of reality, completely out of the mind's reach, yet at the same time experienced at every moment as one's own self-awareness, present in all things. The spherical shape of the sculpture is also significant in terms of tantric iconography because it is a pure geometric form without corners or edges. The sphere has no face to stand on, so it is filled with latent dynamism, with infinite possibility and potential for movement in any direction. This shape therefore represents and elicits the unbounded unity of universal consciousness that is the true nature of the individual. These elements of the sculpture are ways of expressing the qualities of the goddess Parā, and as mentioned previously, there are also means of activating those qualities within the viewer. There are three qualities in particular which are associated with the goddess Parā that are relevant to discuss within this context: Icha, Pratyabha, and Chamatkara. The word Icha is in common language meaning desire. However, in this context, it is not a desire for an object or an experience that we have knowledge about already, but rather it is the unconditional impulse of desire. In the Trika tradition, Icha is defined as a precognitive, creative urge towards self-expression. It is the impulse behind the manifestation of the universe and behind also all artistic expression that is done for its own sake. It is the initial stirring of the unconditioned will of consciousness to manifest, the primordial motive force of consciousness, without which nothing else would arise, and everything would remain just static and formless. So Icha is the desire of the goddess Parā to experience herself, for no other reason than to delight in the creative act itself. At the level of the individual, this subtlest of movements surges up from the core of one's being freely and autonomously. It's not the product of a logical argument or a rational thought or persuasion. When an artist is seized by the unconditional urge to create, by an impulse that does not require justification nor explanation, this is a direct experience of the cosmic will, Icha, of the goddess Parā operating through an embodied being. If this impulse is allowed to flow unimpeded of its own accord, it will inevitably be accompanied by the guidance of intuitive insight, Pratyabha. Pratyabha is a technical term in the field of aesthetics and the philosophy of language. However, in the Tantra Loka, Abhinavagupta uses this word not only to describe the qualities of the goddess Parā, but as an actual name for her, Goddess Pratyabha, Pratyabha Devi, which qualifies and signifies the aspect of ultimate reality which she represents. A single word for Pratyabha does not exist in English, but it could be translated as creative inspiration, intuitive insight, or divine knowledge. We could consider Pratyabha as the sudden flash of insight that compels the poet to put pen to paper, or the vision like lightning from beyond that seizes the painter. It's also the underlying impulse that inspires a bird to sing, and the innate intelligence of the newly born kitten that moves it towards the mother's teat. It's not only an individual human skill, but rather the underlying intuitive intelligence force of consciousness. This macrocosmic characteristic of the goddess Parā, moving through the microcosmic channel of the embodied being, is what moves all great artists, constituting the very essence of their creativity. It is an inherent quality of reality, which is beyond any individual's ability to produce or to own it. It can, however, be easily confused by the artist as something self-generated if the artist's mind attempts to take possession of it. On the other hand, the artist who honors the originating impulse of creativity, icha, and surrenders to the unfolding of intuitive insight, pratyabha, will inevitably create art that touches the core of being and expresses that which is eternal. The term Chamatkara means wonder or aesthetic rapture. It is the ecstatic experience of a fully expanded state of awareness that sums up both the activity of consciousness and the contemplation which is the result of its action. According to André Padoux, Paravak is characterized by Chamatkara, wonder, thrill of joy, wonderment, and ecstatic rapture, experienced by consciousness at its self-revelation and its self-awareness, or when contemplating the manifestation that it holds within itself. So one experiences Goddess Parā as Chamatkara when consciousness becomes suffused with such beauty that the experience of time fades away. As one is swept up in aesthetic delight, the fundamental nature of consciousness, unafflicted by thought constructs, is revealed, and the sense of a separate self dissolves into an experience of one eternal being. This understanding is at the very core of Abhinavagupta's aesthetic theory, elucidated here by Raniero Gnoli, and I quote, "During the aesthetic experience, the consciousness of the spectator is free of all practical desires. The spectacle is no longer felt in connection with the empirical eye of the spectator, nor in connection with any other individual. It has the power of abolishing the limited personality of the spectator, who regains momentarily his immaculate being, not yet overshadowed by Maya." So according to Abhinavagupta, the purpose of art is to exercise our capacity to perceive the fundamental reality of all things. An artwork gives access to the reality of pure aesthetic continuity, which otherwise would remain unnoticed amidst the distractions of everyday life. Art can take us for a moment outside of space and time, because we are looking at something captured by the artist in a timeless moment of unity with the ever-present creative force of consciousness. In other words, the contemplation of art is participating in the act of creating a work of art, and the act of creating a work of art is participating in the Goddess Parā's act of creating the whole world. The teachings of Trika Shaivism articulate how through specific practices and identification with the qualities embodied by the Goddess Parā, Chamatkara is realized as the fundamental nature of consciousness, no longer limited to the experience of a specific object or event, but in an inherent quality of being, making the whole of life a work of art. It is this Goddess Parā who, in sculpted form, becomes a mirror for the beauty and the power we have inherent within ourselves to be experienced and ultimately revealed. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you very much, Christianji. It was wonderful how you took us from aesthetic ideas of Pratibha, and if it is Vyakarana Darshana, Spota Darshana, from Pratibha it goes to Vyavahara. If it is Alankara Shastra, from Pratibha it goes to things like Rasa, and how it is, you said that it is different from, probably a historian would say that because Vakyapadiyam is older than Abhinavagupta's works, a historian might say that Pratibha was taken from Vakyapadiyam and was given a philosophicization of general universal experience of reality itself. And a historian might like to prefer saying that Pratibha as an aesthetic concept is as old as Kamaha. So within Alankara Shastra, Pratibha was traveling from the time of Dhamma through the later Alankarikas, and by the time Abhinav Gupta was using it for his Trika view of experience itself, experience of existence itself, experience of being itself, as you rightly said, it was already, technically it was traveling. The word was traveling and the concept was already traveling. And Chamatkara as a word, I remembered an English poet, Walt Whitman. There is a famous quote from him: "Every hour in light and dark is a miracle for me."
That's it.
Probably Walt Whitman was not aware of Chamatkara theory. It was just his simple poetic response to his life experience. But he would come to know that there is a well-structured theory of this idea that every hour in light, in dark is a miracle for him. He would definitely enjoy knowing this. So this experience of Chamatkara in every moment of life, and that as a message of Parā, that as a bell ringing from Parā to reach itself self-reflexively, is a wonderful presentation from you. And definitely from this presentation, all the audience also today, if they travel with you, would have got the experience of Chamatkara backwards to Pratibha and to their own Ichha. But at least a seed idea would fall in the mind, and through the methods that are delineated by Abhinav Gupta in his multiple works, each one can practice as a sadhaka and travel backwards from the everyday, every moment experience of Chamatkara to the Ichha and Parā experience, Parā in themselves. Thank you very much.
Namaste. Thank you. Beautifully summarized. Thank you.